Welcome to the video on the jointed crankbait. As you saw in the introduction there, I always start with just tracing out the general shape that I want. I work off of a picture that I have to the side. You may see it here in a moment. I always just start with the profile of the bait, a 2D profile, and I trace it on. A piece of wood I'm using here is a piece of basswood, and I had tried to make a face on it. I did not like the face, and so we are getting rid of that and making a crankbait out of it. Pretty standard stuff, really. Just making the shape. We moved over to the vise, and as you can see, we're cutting out the shape of the crankbait, just the 2D general profile of the crankbait. I always use a coping saw for this because I can closely match my profiles, turns, corners, things like that. At this point, the bait is pretty rough. You can see here I'm going to go back in and I'm going to cut the resting area for the lip at a different angle than I had originally cut it. It was such an extreme angle that it would just facilitated me having to come back in and recut that angle. And there we go. Okay, here I'm marking where I want to put the joint in the crankbait. I just spitballed this measurement. I don't know. I think I went just a little behind halfway. I figured that might give me the best swim, especially since I'm putting a tail on this crankbait. You can see I finding the center, and I'm going to find the angle that I want to basically cut my crankbait apart. If you just went straight across, the crankbait would not wobble. So you cut a little bit of an angle, and it's going to have more movement in the water. Plus, you won't see the joint as much when we're finished. So here we are in the vise. I'm going to cut this. I'm almost going to cut it in half. You want to leave it together because we got to carve the shape of the lure yet. So I'm not going to cut it completely apart at this time. There we go. Flip her around. Go from the other side. And it just kind of becomes a back and forth type of thing. At this point, we're only getting close, as you can see. All right, we take the knife and cut out the shape of the lure at this point. Obviously, I'm not moving this fast in real life. It's sped up. It's sped up. You got to be careful with the knife. Obviously, very sharp, and it's always best to limit the amount of movement your knife can have in any given direction, keeping your limbs clear, of course. But you see I'm using my thumb as a stop, and my hand can only move so far. If it was unsupported by my thumb or another part of my hand, then the knife can go as far as my arm can go at that point. So this is limiting how far the knife can go if I slip. Kind of an important thing. Here I'm adjusting the angle for my lip on the lip of the crankbait. It's going to go over top of the head of the crankbait, as you probably saw in the thumbnail for the video. And I'm just adjusting and fine-tuning that. And we'll fine-tune it. I think I do it off camera with a piece of sandpaper. Just finish it up. Excuse me. There's that picture. You can kind of see I was verifying the lip angles and the general shape against my drawing. And the rest of this is just some fine tuning here and there. Try to get it as close as I can with the knife. It always ends up a bit faceted, but I can get the rest of it with sandpaper, as you see here. I almost always go with a 220 grit sandpaper because I get it very close with the knife, as I said before. And, you know, it doesn't pay to leave a bunch of sanding gouges with really heavy grip sandpaper because you're just going to have to go through and smooth it out anyways. So basswood's very soft and it sands really nicely. You don't want to inhale the dust. It can irritate your lungs, you know, all that. You end up coughing a lot. And you just want to be careful. Wear a respirator. You can't see it on camera, but I am. There we go. So taking the opportunity to do some fine tuning on the tail of the lure and the lip area and all over it. And then we move on to making the lip shape and the tail shape. I think I already did the lip shape in this scene. And so we're doing the tail shape. I'm going to draw it on with a pencil, and then I kind of like to go back over the pencil lines with the permanent marker. Flush them in so it's easier to see, especially for on camera because, you know, my camera doesn't pick up the pencil very well. So there you go. You can see the tail shape and the lip shape. And that's how they're going to fit, basically. And we will move on to cutting it out with a coping saw here in a moment. I like to use Lexan because I can cut it with a coping saw and use a belt sander to refine the shape afterwards. If I used acrylic panels, then they would likely shatter when I try to cut them with the coping saw. And also, if you're going to use the bait in any kind of rocky situation, acrylic panels tend to shatter also. So in those situations, if it hits the bottom too hard. So Lexan, you know, affords me that extra strength and durability. And it really doesn't cost that much more. This panel was not expensive. I think it was $11. And goodness, we could make, well, I don't know, 100 baits or something out of it. It's not that expensive. Not when you consider how much you would spend on a bait in the store. You know, at $8 to $15 a pop, maybe $4, $5, $6, $7, $8 a pop. A little sheet of Lexan like this isn't that much. And there we go. You're going to do some adjustments, move things around. You always want to try to cut as close to the vise as possible when you're dealing with a saw, because then your material doesn't flop around as much. Unfortunately, with the shape of the panel and, you know, how shallow my vise is, then it ends up way up in the air and you can see it just flopping around like that, like a fish. No pun intended. All right, so now in this scene, we're going to cut the bait in half for our joint. You can see I go from both sides a little bit at a time. You can see it's starting to get close. A little bit at a time from this top to from the bottom. You want it to be as even as possible, even though I'm going to go in there with sandpaper and a couple of files and clean it up, but get it as close as you can, because a couple seconds on the saw is worth 10 minutes out with a sandpaper. There you go, just cleaning it up. Easy peasy. Excuse me. Yep, it's a nice fit. There's going to be a bit of wire that holds the two halves apart, so getting it completely perfect isn't that pivotal, but it does look better if it's nice. And right now all I'm doing is taking away that fuzz left by the saw, so that when we I don't know, paint it and cover it in the whole 9 yards, I don't end up with like a fuzzy, sloppy looking bait, because I don't want that. The fish don't care, but I don't want it. Fitment's looking pretty good. A couple more things and do a little bit of carving here to even up the joint, and we'll be done with that. Here I got some very thin super glue. I'm going to seal that area immediately. Excuse me. Start with the end grains because it soaks in so fast, dries fast with end grain. Especially with that end grain, you want to make sure it's covered pretty well, because if it's not, that's where the water ingress will happen. On long grain wood, water doesn't soak in so easily, but with the end grains, it's like having a bunch of straws. The ends of the straws pointed up, and that's where the water is going to go, right? Because they're straws. That's basically the grain of the wood. If you pour water on a bundle of straws from the side, they don't soak any water, and same thing happens there. So there we go. I got them sealed. We're going to put on, or we're going to sand it smooth, because if you don't, well, any blemishes in the finish that you just put on it will show through the paint, and then in the final product you'll end up with a lumpy looking bait. Once again, fish don't care, but I care. So a little extra step. If you're at home and you want to give this a try and you don't feel like doing this extra step, you don't really need to. The fish don't care. And especially if you're not selling the baits, fish don't care. Okay, I moved on here. You can't see, but I marked where the eyes that I want to use go. And, excuse me. I set the bait on a piece of foam to sort of hold it in place, and I use a Forstner bit. It turned out that it was a 3/8 inch Forstner bit, which was a little big, but it was all I had for this situation. And I set the bait on a piece of foam, and I get my fingers out of the way, as you can see, and I let the foam do the work of holding the bait in place. It's a 3D object, and it would be so difficult to use a drill press, even though that would probably be a safer option. It'd be very difficult to do it. There we go. We're drilling the excuse me, holes for the hook eyes, and also for the eyes that are going to hold the two halves of the bodies together in the middle. You can see I'm trying to line everything up and figure out where I want my hooks. And there we go. Hook holes drilled. I went a little far on that one and poked through the other side, but we filled it with some baking soda and super glue off camera. So that's all sealed up and ready to go. Now, the reason I sealed the bait before I did all this drilling was I found that if I don't seal it first, I can end up with like really fuzzy tear out for my drill bits. Now here I am fitting the tail that I cut out. Made the slot, fit the tail. Everything looked good there. So we moved on to drilling for the ballast, the weight, so the bait stays upright. I think this is going to be a top water bait, top water swim bait sort of idea, but it's still going to need some weight. Otherwise you can't cast it, and it won't or may not sit upright in the water, which is what we want. We want it to remain upright because, that's what fish do, unless they're in distress, and sometimes that's what you're going for, but that's not the case this time. All right, holes are drilled, and now we're going to fill it with ballast. This is, I think it's a silver solder. It's pretty heavy. It's not as heavy as lead. It's also a lot safer to use than lead as far as environmental hazards go and breathing it in. So I kind of like to use it that way. This is a technique that I'm using because I don't have a lead pot. So I'm just using a soldering iron that's hot and dribbling the hot solder down into that cavity that we had drilled earlier. And that's all it is. I put a tiny little bit of flux on the soldering iron because then it helps the solder flow and stay liquid longer. If you dribble, hot solder into the cavity of the lure, it can solidify too quickly. Here I'm putting a little bit of super glue on it because I've had problems in the past with like lead or solder popping out of the bodies after I've fished, from the impacts and strikes and stuff. And here we go. We're going to put a little baking soda on that super glue, and you just kind of alternate those back and forth a little bit at a time, and it builds up that body cavity like Bondo. Excuse me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little more super glue, a little more baking soda, build it up, and then you take a file and knock off the rough edges, the top of it, and contour it down to the shape of the bait body, and then I always just finish it with some sandpaper and call her good. Maybe put a little bit more super glue on top of it to seal everything up. All right, we're going on to making these hook eyes. This is, can't think if it's 20 or 22 gauge stainless steel wire. Just put it in the drill chuck, and then it goes on that tool I put in the vise. That's a Torx wrench or whatever you want to call it that I found laying around on the floor of my shop, and it just happened to be the right diameter, so that's what we use for that. Here we are, just trimming off the excess and making our pieces. And now for that jointed piece, I slip one of the hook eyes on the piece of wire. We're going to chuck it in the drill and then go through the process again of turning it on that Torx bit there that was laying on the floor. There we go. I got it more positively in the drill chuck this time. And that's all there is to it. I'm going to go ahead and install those pieces. Give a little dab of super glue down the hole that we made, and then you just turn them in like a screw or any other thing. And so there's a mechanical bond and a chemical bond. And then eventually they're going to have epoxy over them holding it all together anyways too. So these should be very incredibly strong hookups or hook points. Shouldn't take quite a bit to pull them out. Which, I'm not saying it's not possible, but it takes a lot. Yep, a little dab of super glue on there to hold it all together again, and on to the next one. Yep, I had a little trouble with this one getting it started, but once it went, and that was that. Turn, turn, turn. All right, this is opaque white. Obviously, we're going to move on to painting this bait at this point. This Createx opaque white. We're just going to spray the whole thing white to begin with. And after this, then we'll get into mixing the color. And we move on to the primary color on the bait. We're going to use a yellow and green mixture, more like a chartreuse. I don't have chartreuse paint, but why not mix it, right? A little Createx yellow, a little transparent green. No, much more yellow than green. I think I only went with 1 drop of green there. And we mix it up. If I mix in the airbrush, I use like this zip tie, and it doesn't scratch the inside of the airbrush or damage it in any way, so I like to use that. You can see that we come up with what looks like a pretty greenish chartreuse, but once we spray it on top of the white, it will go much back, or it will go back towards the yellow side of things. And we're going to add just a little bit of pearl white for some sheen, for a little bit of shine. Because let's face it, the prey animals that fish eat in the wild are usually somewhat iridescent, have a little bit of shine to them underneath the water. Yep, that's a nice color. I like that. We're going to go with that. So as you can see, I just keep turning the bait, moving it, spraying it all over evenly with this color. It's my airbrush wasn't working perfectly at the time, so instead of getting frustrated and tearing it all apart, I just decided I would keep going and just be patient with what I had and keep working. There we go. Back to the tail section here. See, I had already done 1 coat when I started filming, but you get the idea. All right, I made this stencil out of Mylar plastic that I got at a Joann's Fabrics. Any hobby shop carries this sort of thing. We're just doing straight red over top of that chartreuse color for kind of a tiger stripe. It's not exactly a fire tiger. It's not the same colors. Excuse me. And I'm trying to be careful here to make sure that my 2 halves have the same basic height to my tiger stripe, so that when the whole bait is assembled, it'll look symmetrical, more or less. You know, turned out pretty good. A little bit of trick to that. You didn't see me do this on camera, but you got to make sure that the back side of your stencil stays dry. And if it's not dry, you need to wipe it off, because if it's wet with paint and you try to set it on top of your bait, it'll smear everywhere and you'll end up with a big mess. And you don't want that, because then you got to wipe it off or start over, whatever. So you didn't see me do that on camera. I should have just showed it, but yeah, I went just flipped it over, made sure it was either dry with no paint, or I've had to do it where I just have another paper towel off camera and I just smear the paint off and dry the thing. It only takes a second. So there we go. Some nice tiger stripes, kind of a reverse upside down tiger stripe. This is Createx Detail Violet. And I'm just going to go with a stripe down the back to kind of darken that, blend everything together. So we'll do that on the head and the tail of the bait. Yep, just blend it all together. Kind of doing the eye socket so that if I have any discrepancy in how I drill it, it'll camouflage that a little bit. Here we go, doing the tail now. Didn't take much. Here's a pattern I made out of that same Mylar plastic for a gill slit, and you can see I work my way from off of the plastic onto the bait so that I can how do you want to say it? Modulate how much paint goes on the bait. If you just went directly onto the bait with the spray, you're going to end up with very dark gill plates. Here we go. We're going to put on the lip. And I put on way too much glue. I had to shake some off. We're going to stick the lip on though with the super glue. And then eventually what's going to happen is the epoxy that I put all over the bait to completely seal it will be over top of the lip also and hold it all on. So right now it's just being held on a little bit by the super glue. Just long enough to where I can drill a hole through it to put on the, swivel eye, the leader eye. It's looking pretty good. It's starting to actually look like something. Put the tail in and we're just going to hold it in with a drop or two of super glue. But the tail itself will be held on with the epoxy. Yep, I use thin super glue for this so it runs down in. That's all it takes. Not a whole lot. Doesn't take a lot. I'll go up on the bait, turn her to dry. There we go. It's time to put some eyes on this thing. You just use super glue to hold them on because they get covered with epoxy like everything else. And then that's actually what's going to hold them on. They're a little tricky to use though because they have an adhesive backing on them that tends to want to stick to your gloves. So sometimes they can be a bit fiddly, a little futzy. You can see I was having a little bit of difficulty with that one, but we got it. Starting to look like something now, isn't it? Just float a little bit of super glue down in there. It wasn't sticking very well, so that took care of it. Alright, this is just that Createx red. I wanted it on the tail. Got a little bit dark, but it's okay. I'm using a very stiff bristle brush to kind of simulate the rays on fin. Because I didn't want just a completely homogeneous red color on the tail. It would have looked, well, too red, too odd. So by having a little bit of striation, I don't know, in my brain it makes it look a little bit more like an actual fish's tail. I don't know if any fish that bite on this are going to look that closely at it, but you never know. There we're drilling the hook eye hole. Or I shouldn't say hook eye, this is the leader eye hole. Whatever you want to call it, I guess. I'm just making most of these terms up as I go. And so once the hole is drilled and ready to go, we put a little dab of super glue in that too. And then just turn in the that eye that we had made out of wire. Now I made a mistake here and I didn't drill the hole in the Lexan larger than the one in the body. I know that now, if I'm going to recreate this, that I have to make a larger hole in the Lexan than in the body of the lure. Because what happened was, when I started to turn it in, it got in halfway into the body of the lure, and then the Lexan lifted away from the body of the lure, and I had to go back in and make that hole larger. And then the hook eye or leader eye did not get stuck on the Lexan and pull it away from the body. So a lesson learned there if you are going to do this. Here I'm just using a little two-part epoxy. It's Lumalite. It works really well. It dries incredibly slowly and it cures really slowly. So if you're going to use this product, just be aware it takes about 3 to 4 days at 70-degree weather to lose all of its tackiness. So you don't want it somewhere where there's going to be a lot of sawdust or any kind of contamination, because it can get stuck to the lure. And also you wouldn't want to touch it, especially with your bare hands, because it will attract all of the oil in your hands and make it look really dull. But here we go. We're just going to apply it with an applicator. This is a silicone applicator. I got it Hobby Lobby. Well worth its weight in gold, because I was using paintbrushes on my first lures, and you use them once and the epoxy sets up and then you're done. This is multi-use because you can just clean the epoxy off when you're done with it. A little bit of rubbing alcohol. If you can't get all of it off, it'll just come right off of the silicone. So I can use it over and over and over again, and it was well worth, I think it was $5 or $6 or something. So really not even hardly much more than a paintbrush, like a throwaway type paintbrush. Yeah, you can see I'm filling all of those voids with epoxy so that it holds the tail on to the lure really well. Was kind of, or am kind of paranoid about that. Here we go. We've got the first coat of epoxy on. There's on the lure turner. I did not film the second coat of epoxy because it's the same as the first. You don't probably be bored with that. Here we are going to put the put the joint together in the middle, and I'm using 5-minute epoxy for this because I needed it to set up really quickly. One of the holes has to be much larger, or not much larger, but large enough to where that joint can just slip in. Because if you try to do like a turn or a twist fit, friction fit, you're going to run into problems because the two halves won't fit together in that case. So one of the holes is a friction fit, and then the other one has some play in it so that you can just put the wire into the hole. And you'll see that kind of comes back a little bit to bite me because I was a little bit too large, and it causes a sloppy fit. Here I'm just working that epoxy down into the hole. This is another applicator. I think it was 99 cents for a whole pack of these. And it's also made out of silicone, so I can reuse it over and over again. So there we go. Get some epoxy on that wire, and into the hole it goes. So I messed up there. You can see I have to redo things because the friction fit is on the other side. And I made a bit of a mistake there, but it's okay. It's 5-minute epoxy. I had 5 minutes to fix it. It doesn't take that long to put some wire in a hole like that. So we fixed it, or I fixed it. Now I'm just coating everything with a liberal amount of epoxy so that it holds it all together, and just stand it up how I want it. Easier said than done with a 3D object. But then we're just going to leave it to set up and cure and do its thing. And there we go. There's the final bait. I went ahead and put the hooks on off camera because that's kind of boring to watch. But yeah, finished bait. Well, I want to thank you all for watching. Hopefully you found this amusing and instructive, and hope to see you again soon. All right. Thank you.